Hello, Dr. Salem. You're muted on me.
Hey there, sorry. It did it on going live. It's great to be here. I'm so excited about this episode.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if everyone knows who Elise is, but she's also known as Elise the embryologist all over TikTok and over Instagram. And it's gonna be a fun show. It's as we said, kind of going into the secrets of the lab. I mean, there's probably things I don't even know. And I've been in the lab many times, so she might have some secrets even we might find out about that we're going to talk to our embryologist about. Elise, you mind introducing yourself to the people who are going to be coming on this, just a little bit about yourself and kind of like your story, just how you also how you got into embryology, and then again, it'd be great to hear about your story.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank y'all so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. This is so fun. My name's Elise. I'm an embryologist. I have been in the field since 2017, 2018. My background is in genetics from NC State. Go Pack. I'm a big NC State lover. That was actually the only university I applied to, so I'm glad I got in because I could have got it right. But studied genetics there. In my last year of undergrad, I knew, you get to the point where you have to decide what you're going to do. I was like, I don't really want to do grad school, PA school, med school. I'm kind of burned out from school right now. Let's explore some other things. Had an interest in women's health and reproductive health, and did some Google searching, found embryology, and was like, I think this is something that I'll enjoy. It's got patient care, and lab work. And I feel like I can make a difference, and the science is so cool. Let's see how I can get into this. I actually reached out to all of the labs in my area because there isn't really a lot of information, at least at the time, on how to get into the field. Had one clinic get back to me, was able to shadow there, and then start part-time while I was still in undergrad. And then when I graduated, they had a full-time position open up, and I was able to kind of work my way through there. So really kind of a little bit of luck, a little bit of work on my end to get into that position. And then I was able to train all the way through all of the embryology procedures there, and then started my social media pages in early 2021, which is what brought us together. I really felt that there was a need to educate patients on what we do in the lab, what we see in the lab, because it's such a mystery for a lot of patients. They don't get to see their embryologist, so they don't even really know what questions to ask their physicians about what happened in the lab. So my goal was to try to demystify some of the things that we do.
It's interesting when I first started kind of getting into social media, I was doing like the podcast, and when I started with TikTok, and I'll be honest, TikTok's a little harder for me. I just don't have that as much time, but when I started it, I really did show like a background to things that people never got to see. They never got to see what an ICSI looked like. And it was interesting because there wasn't a lot of people doing it at first. They were doing some basic stuff. And so when I started doing it, and then I started noticing like it just blew up. Like now everyone's showing ICSI, they're showing sperm, like the things that, never saw. And it's funny because at first it's like everyone really liked it. And I'm sure people still like it now, but I mean, in the beginning it was like 5 million, 6 million views because everyone was so interested. Like it reminds me of like the moon landing, like when that happened, everyone's watching TV. Now, like we send a probe out, comes back, lands, and gets caught between two chopsticks, and no one cares about it. It's just, it's like, oh, we've seen that. We've seen plenty of sperm now. So it's funny how people have got used to it. But I still think there's a lot that they can learn tonight. I think there's some more secrets that sometimes you can't make a video about, and I think what was going to be really cool about talking to you tonight, and I really hope we get a lot of guests come on here because this is their chance to really talk to an embryologist, is this kind of feeling of, what does the embryologist think? How much are they into this? Is it just a job to them? And as if you met many embryologists, it's not just a job. Mm-hmm. Like they're like the greatest babysitter on earth. I mean, they care so much about your embryos. Like they are saddened. Their emotions are in this. And like I said, it's a pretty tough job, and I know you may not have the direct thing with the patients like we have to talk to them, but really neat. So I'm really looking forward to that insight for people. And I have a lot of questions for you too, but I'm gonna let Dr. Salem have a turn here to ask some things too, and then we'll get to some of the questions that were sent in to us and some of the people coming on.
Yeah, no, this is so exciting. I love seeing your content on social media and stuff. It's so cool how you describe things to everybody. And I think you just kind of bring the mysteries of the lab in like ways that people can relate to it and talk about. So I thought we'd kind of kick it off with a question that's kind of very interesting to me. And I think it's probably interesting to a lot of people, but you know, a lot of people are talking about AI and AI in the lab. And,
Mhm.
not many parts of medicine are able to take advantage of AI quite yet, but I think we're really well positioned in our field. And I would love to know from your perspective where you see AI maybe in our world 2, 3, whatever, 5 years from now, about some exciting things that are on the horizon. And then we'll go back into the stuff that we're actually doing right now.
Yeah, no, I love to look ahead. Um, you see lots of really interesting research on AI. I unfortunately haven't been in a lab that actually uses AI in practice, but I've learned a lot about AI. So the AI softwares that are out there are their goal is to help the embryologist choose the best embryo for transfer because we as much as we can look at it and say, "Oh, this is a really beautiful embryo," we still don't know 100% if this embryo is going to be the one that makes the baby. And AI has the ability to look at so much data and try to give us a better idea of which embryo to choose. I have not read enough research that shows that it's better than us choosing at this point, but I think it's going to get there. I think in the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be great at checking those things, and we're going to be relying on AI heavily to say this is the embryo, this is what we're seeing in embryo development that tells us that this is the embryo to choose, and I think it will really aid us a lot. I'm excited to see what the future holds with AI.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things like the parallel that I think of is like radiology, where, the embryologist by themselves is really good. And the AI by themselves is not as good as the radiologist. But when you pair the AI with the embryologist or with the radiologist, it's even better than the embryologist or the radiologist alone. So do you think that's kind of where we're going?
I do think we're gonna get there for sure. I think we're really close. I like I said, 3 to 5 years. I think we're gonna have something out there that really changes the game in terms of selecting embryos for transfer. Just the time lapse imaging alone has given us so much information from an embryology perspective. Like we're able to see things that we were never able to see before. So like things like reverse cleavage, where you're seeing an embryo on day 3 that's got multiple, maybe it's a 3 cell. It's not the best looking day 3. And then it reverts back to a 2 cell, like things like that we couldn't catch before because, you're that time lapse is taking a picture every 10 minutes, but we're not taking the embryo out of the incubator every 10 minutes. So we're just getting so much more information, and we're going to get better at using all of that data to tell us something about the embryos or the outcome. So I'm excited about it.
Very cool. Very, very cool.
Well, we have a guest here, Melissa, that we're bringing on the stage here that you can talk to. And Melissa, how are you doing?
Yeah. Good. How are you?
Fantastic. Well, we have Elise here who's answering questions. So, I mean, if you want to know the secrets of the lab, she's all ears.
I have always wondered what goes on back there. But um so a little background, I have done 8 egg retrievals, and unfortunately I don't have anything to show for it. We haven't been able to freeze any embryos out of that. And my question kind of more relates to like fertilization and you know why don't the eggs get fertilized if you're using XC? And when they do get fertilized, is there a point where if it stops growing by day 3, you can tell that it's like a sperm issue? Or how can you tell who truly has the issue? Because every time I ask this question, no one can seem to really give me an idea. And, I'll ask about egg quality, and they're like, well, the egg looked fine, the sperm looked fine, we just don't know. And I feel like there has to be something more than we just don't know.
Yeah, so we definitely are still learning more, but there is some information that I think we figured out to some extent. So it is true that sometimes egg and sperm do look good because we can't see the mechanisms of how they actually fertilize at this point. So DNA, for example, we can see if an egg has morphological abnormalities, but we can't tell the quality of that DNA just by looking at the egg, right? Some of the things that we see with failed fertilization can be a sperm issue or an egg issue. So if sperm don't have the correct parts of it, so maybe it's missing an acrosome or doesn't have intact DNA, we can see issues with fertilization. I get this question a lot because I think it's very common to have and y'all, I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts as well on a lot of times patients are pushed to donor egg much sooner than they're pushed to donor sperm. And I've seen a lot of cases where we have lots of failed cycles and a patient moves to donor egg, and then we still see failure. And then we're like, okay, now we think it's the sperm, but the sperm donor is so much more affordable than going to egg donor. And so I find that really interesting that that's often the first thing that's pushed, but we know the egg, contributes a good bit. Some of the research that I've read is showing that the egg's DNA is responsible for development up to day 3, and then the whole genome is taking over at that point, which includes the sperm. And so that day 3 hump is a really big one. We see a lot of arrests between day 3 and day 5. So a lot of times if they're looking good on day 3 and then we have complete arrest and we're not seeing any development after day 3, I've had physicians consider looking into sperm DNA fragmentation testing, because the entire genome's kind of taking over at that point. Those are kind of my thoughts. I'd love to hear y'all's experiences with patients that are having that, arrest at that point.
Dr. Sam, did you want to answer?
Sure, I'll give it my 2 cents really quickly, and then I'd love to hear what you have to say here, Dr. Amols. So, I mean, it's true. Sometimes there's just so many variables in IVF that it's hard to tease out what is the one that is, creating the biggest, bottleneck point. And one thing that at least you mentioned that's really interesting is this idea of well, sometimes if we really believe it's an egg issue, we use an egg donor. Or sometimes if we really believe that it's a sperm issue, we'll use a sperm donor. And I think those are good things. I think, that's what we call empiric treatment. We're just trying something to see what gives, if you will. And we're using our best professional judgment to say, what should we do first, a donor egg or a donor sperm, that kind of a thing. But Dr. Amols, I mean, this is a really complex part of our field. I mean, what do you think? It's really tricky.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of part of it. Maybe Melissa's point of view. I think one of the things that for patients that's very difficult, and at least I'm sure you can get this question, is that it's hard to understand if you take a sperm and you force it into an egg. In our minds, we think once the sperm's in there, fertilization happens. And it's not that simple. Fertilization is actually a process of meiosis that has to occur. And so there can be problems at the sperm, there can be problems at the egg. So sometimes they don't fertilize and it doesn't make sense why. And I can understand that. As a patient, I would think that too before I knew what I knew. The next part then is then fertilizing normal. And so there's things called 0 PNs, there's 3 PNs, there's multipolar bodies. And so even when it fertilizes, it doesn't fertilize normal. And so, Melissa, I'm so sorry, man, that's a lot of cycles to not come away with anything. And, I hopefully if I met you before, I've had a chance to look at your stuff, but I actually dealt with this a patient today who same thing, didn't get anything. I was just talking to Lisa about this before we came on. And they just told her she had bad eggs and she's really young. And it's crazy. She's thinking about donor. And some of the things I was going through was about the sperm. And one of the things that we say when we talk about sperm, we say it's good. I always remind people, for every million sperm that's ejaculated, 1 sperm gets to the egg. And most sperm is bad. So when we say sperm is good, what we're just saying is in general, it looks good, but it doesn't mean that at the level of the DNA, when it comes to, even getting today, all that stuff we can't tell just from analysis. And so I agree with you, Elise. I think it's crazy how often we do push donor eggs. And I think part of it is because I think it's how women are just generally more nurturing. And I feel like, like guys are almost always against a donor sperm. I remember when I thought we had to potentially use, I'm like, I don't know if I want to do that. I'd rather adopt. And I see that a lot. I see a lot of men will be like, well, I'd rather adopt or use a donor embryo since neither of our DNA than it be, where a lot of women are just like, no, I'll do it. I just want a baby. And I know as a parent, I'm going to be great. And it is interesting. We do jump to that. And I had the conversation with someone today where I said, it's a sperm. I said to them, I go, there's no question it's a sperm. And I said, go do a tessie so we can get better quality sperm. And then my embryologist could do better with it. And so when it comes to your question, Melissa, like I said, it's convoluted because we don't know enough. The thing I was bringing up to you, Elise, was this. If it makes it to day 5, though, you can biopsy it. And then you can actually find out where the problem's coming from. It's interesting that you were talking about the day 3. I used to hear it the other way around where people used to say, oh, it was the sperm up to then. And I think there's a lot of parts, right? Mm-hmm. Fertilization can definitely be a sperm problem, but you can tell when it's difference between the sperm or the egg, right? All the eggs are really abnormal looking, abnormal shape, and then it doesn't fertilize and the sperm looks good, more likely the egg. But, there's times where the sperm, you're sitting on the outside and then they're getting in, then, it's a sperm problem. So I wish it was as simple as just one thing. I know with the videos you make and the videos we make, we try to explain it, but it really is quite complicated, Melissa. And so I hope you actually listen to Elise's Instagram stuff, and I think you'll learn a lot more. But it's a great question you're asking. And I wish we had the answer for you, but in general, it's very, very complex.
No, I actually follow her on TikTok, so
okay.
I've seen some of her videos on TikTok. And Dr. Amols, you know me very well.
Oh, I know who this is then. Okay, yes. Oh, my heart goes out to you then. I know exactly your situation.
Yeah, I was going to let you know the news, but I'm on here, so I figured I'd let the world know. But anyway, do I have time for one more question?
Of course.
So, because we are starting to maybe reevaluate using donor eggs, despite how expensive they are. And, I wasn't really like wanting to do that at first, but now I'm thinking, maybe that would be a route that we go. And my fear is if we do go that route, like you mentioned, how do we know that the sperm will even fertilize them? And so if we do go that route, would you say like doing a DNA fragment test would help us be able to tell if they would get fertilized, or is it just really unknown?
Yeah, I can tell you my personal opinion is because you have to do ICSI anyways, especially if you're using frozen eggs, we would be using what's called the Zymot chip already, and we would be basically removing most of the DNA fragmentation, which is the treatment for it. There's nothing wrong doing the test to figure it out. At least I don't know if there's anything else you would recommend, like a pixie dish or anything like that.
I was just going to say, I like DNA fragmentation to an extent, but there's only so many actionable things you can do about it, at least from my experience. So the Zymot, I really like it. It's easy for us to use. We always love doing those. They're so easy. So even if DNA fragmentation is high, what can you really do to improve that? It's more of a sperm selection at that point. And so if you're already incorporating something like Zymot, it may be worth saving your money and maybe putting that money towards something else. The other thing I was going to mention about donor eggs is it could be worth considering working with a bank that has some sort of blastocyst guarantee. So that may help protect some of your investment in donor eggs. If you're working with a bank that says, we guarantee one blastocyst, and if you don't get that, then they'll replace the lot. Because I know it's a big investment to, financially to kind of get into donor eggs. So could be something to consider to give you a little bit more peace of mind in making that decision.
Okay.
Well,
all right.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you. I miss you. You guys have a good night.
Miss you. I didn't know who it was at first, but I know exactly who it is. And hopefully I'll see you guys at some Dave's Hot Chicken one of these days.
Yes, definitely. Have a good one.
Oh, that's so nice.
So it's actually interesting, at least we don't charge for the Zymot. So that's just part of our practice. We use it across the board as long as we can. Obviously, there's some situations where you can't because the sperm count is too low and stuff
Mhm.
like that. What's your thought on the pixie dish? Are you a fan of that?
I I don't see a lot of clinics using it in practice. I think the research, like some of the other, like sperm selection, is mixed
Yeah.
on if it's improving things. And I think if it's something that's universally used, like the Zymo, I know a lot of clinics that are like, this is just how we process sperm. It's not an extra charge. But for something like Pixie, where it could be an extra charge, I have a hard time saying, yeah, let's do Pixie if it costs the patient more, and the research is still
Yeah.
not, there's not a consensus on whether it's improving things. So I just don't love to charge patients for more for like add-ons and things.
No, I agree 100%. And I like how you went in the donor eggs. Is that I think as embryologists, it must be hard. Like, someone spent $20,000-$30,000 on some eggs, and then sometimes you go to fertilize them and it goes bad. And you don't, in your mind, you're like, I did everything I can. I mean, I can't imagine the stress that puts on you guys.
It can be some pressure, but I think I have found when I have a really good support in the lab, so really great coworkers, a good lab manager, that really makes all the difference because they believe in you, and having that person know you are competent and do a good job, that's really all the extra boost you need to be like, I'm going to tackle this difficult case because I know I'm doing my best for this patient. It really makes all the difference because I've been in both situations where I have really great leadership and not so great leadership. And I see the struggles embryologists have and know the struggles embryologists have when they don't have good leadership, and it impacts patient care. It 100% impacts outcomes.
Talking about, and Dr. Sim, please feel free to jump in anytime. I feel bad I'm taking hostage to this conversation. Talking about that, as an embryologist, a lot of times, people want to do ICSI because they're worried about them not fertilizing. But, I try to tell patients that really standard and SEM is usually better fertilization. And I wasn't sure, how do you, on your videos and in some of your social media stuff, how do you talk to people about that, trying to encourage it? Because I think there is a lot of people who think, oh, well, if I do ICSI, I guarantee it's going to fertilize. And there's some truth to that, right? I mean, yes, if you put the sperm in, you can't have completely failed FERT from the standpoint of the sperm got in, but it doesn't mean it will fertilize. And as you know, it's usually lower than actually standard insemination.
Yeah, I think people forget that when you look, depends on how you're looking at the data. When you're looking at rates for conventional versus ICSI. So if for conventional insemination, we don't always know the maturity of all the eggs. So if you're looking at your denominator being all of the eggs that were inseminated, sometimes the fruit rate doesn't look great. But when you're looking at how many fertilized out of the mature ones, conventional insemination is looking great. And so I don't know if patients always know that nuance. I can understand from the patient perspective, though, feeling like you're having that extra peace of mind. And so I can understand when patients are looking at it more from a peace of mind standpoint. And I think that's an important piece of a lot of the things that we do. Because this is such a stressful journey, patients didn't really want to see us in the first place. If that gives them that extra peace of mind, how does that come into play into how they're choosing, INSEM? But in general, I do think that ICSI is a little overused. I think there are a lot of clinics that are ICSI only. You're not allowed to do conventional, and that is more for the efficiency of the lab and not necessarily because of the outcomes. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with that.
Yeah.
One quick thing, since we're kind of, talking about ICSI and these various things, is a lot of people don't obviously get to see, who the embryologist is that's doing their specific case, and all these kinds of, the amount of deep expertise that you had to develop over the years to be allowed to even do ICSI. I'd love to just hear for a second, because I think I get this question from a lot of people and I give them my 2 cents on it. And as a, REI fellow, I remember we spent some time in the lab with some practice, kind of eggs that were going to be discarded anyways to kind of train on. what ICSI would look like, that kind of a thing. And it was very difficult. And, you know, obviously it would have taken many, many, many more eggs than what I did to be competent at it. And can you just talk to us like really quickly about like what that developmental stage just looks like to be able to do some of these very complex things?
Yeah, so it took me almost 5 years to be fully trained. So it's a long
5
time.
years. Just looking
Yeah.
at this. Wow.
Yeah. So I started in andrology, which is sperm, semen analysis, IUI prep, a little endocrine if you're running like a blood analyzer machine. And so training takes such a long time because of a couple reasons. Some of it is you still have to do your daily work and then try to squeeze in training on the side. So I'd have to convince a senior embryologist to stay 30 minutes after or leave your needles up for me to practice things here and there. And I think there is a big misconception that training embryologists are just out there wild, wild west sort of thing. And that's very much not the case. So we are junior embryologists and training embryologists are monitored in every single thing that they're doing. And it usually starts with some sort of discarded or donated specifically for training material, whether that's eggs, sperm, embryos from a patient. We're working on those things before we're allowed to work on patient cases. So most labs have a training expectation, a training guide. You have to observe this many times. You have to work on discard eggs, embryos, or donated eggs, embryos this many times. Then you get to do 1 egg out of a case of 20 eggs. Then you get to work up to 3 eggs and 5 eggs. And then you're splitting cases 50-50. And then you're the lead on a case. So you're doing majority and the senior is doing a little bit, all while being monitored. All of your statistics are being evaluated at every step of the way. And then you have to do a certain number by yourself under observation. All the stats have to work out. And then you're able to do things on your own. All of the while, even though I'm fully trained and signed off, my stats are looked at quarterly. We sit down, we're looking at the stats. How do they compare to other embryologists? Is there a particular statistic that's a little out of normal? Let's dig a little deeper. Okay, you know, Elise got all of the difficult cases this quarter. Let's take those out as outliers. Are we still in range? And many labs, all labs should have thresholds of where all of their embryologists should be in terms of fertilization rates, blast conversion, embryo survival, and those are looked at often. And I love looking at my stats. I'm like, okay, how am I doing this quarter? Am I up there? Some labs even give little treats to the embryologists that have the best that quarter, things like that. And not every embryologist is the best at every skill. So usually you have one skill that you're like, I always kill it on this particular thing. And the thing that I don't do as well on, I'm going to look at the embryologist that does. Can I tweak my technique closer to theirs to get a little bit better? Those are the best labs, the labs that do that.
Yeah, coaching and peer. I mean, I know Dr. Amols and we do that on the clinical side. Definitely, I'll call him up. Hey, I got this tough case. Here's what I did. What do you think? So, and that collaborative spirit goes such a long way. I mean, that's true of any really good team. But that's interesting to hear that you guys do that at those specific levels. You know, the specific skills. Let's call it. Yeah, that's cool.
I'm still in that idea. I think we might have that. The best like fertilization rate or something. We'll have a contest all the time. I'm taking that from that.
I like it.
So this next person I'm going to bring on, you may know Steve. Steve Brooks. He's an advisor in fertility. He's known this guy for a long time. Really smart. Comes on with the hardest question. So be prepared to he's going to ask you probably a tough question here. But I'm going to bring him on. And hey, Steve.
Hey.
Sorry, I was getting some connection. By the way.
What's that?
I said you're from Canada. I'm glad you're allowed to come on the show tonight because
Well, originally from Trinidad, which you wouldn't hear from the accent because the accent only comes back when I'm drinking rum and coke in the Caribbean. But you wouldn't know it to look at me.
I love it.
So
that's so funny. I know a lab down in Trinidad. That's awesome.
Yeah, I know somebody who works in that lab too. So, and she's now in Australia. So, I was going to follow up on your question on, really identifying the embryologists who are good at certain things. That also implies that there are things that they can work on. One of the things, so for your benefit, Elise, I was for 2.5+ years the chief operating officer at the Fertility Partners, which owns a third of the clinics in Canada, but also had Loom or RMA Connecticut in Connecticut. And
Yeah.
I was driving
I
a
did
lot of
some work at
improvements.
Loom. Sorry to
Oh, you
interrupt,
did?
but
Okay.
yes. So they've got a great team up there. That's
Fantastic.
awesome.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things that I was pushing with our clinics, because very few of them, I was surprised, had an e-witnessing system. And I saw e-witnessing not just to eliminate the extra manual work for double witnessing, and also just to prevent the screw-ups that you keep hearing all the time, but more importantly, and Dr. Amols would really like this, I saw it as a means of identifying where there's opportunities to train and improve, because you could use the e-witnessing to set up a start and stop time on each process by each embryologist, and you could look at both their average time, but more importantly, the distribution. So if you had an embryologist, when adjusted for a number of eggs, whatever, had a huge variation in their ICSI times, like, okay, that person needs some extra training. And it's not to penalize or anything. It's just to really identify where there's a need for some extra training, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the other thing I saw e-witnessing as having a huge value for is in the identification of variability and just overall capability too.
Yeah, I had the same conversation a couple weeks ago. There's a lab that I work at that's implementing electronic witnessing, and they have that same conversation. If there's an outlier, an embryologist that's taking too long to do ICSI or to do biopsy, it does help you kind of narrow that down, especially in a large lab where you have a lot of embryologists to manage. That's such a great point.
Exactly. The other thing, and of course, Dr. Amols, I think I might have shown you this before, and some on the REI side, when they see this, they think, well, I'm not sure I want to do that. But way back when, I used to be a manufacturing engineer at IBM, and I look at an embryology lab and I see a job shop manufacturing operation. It's artisan, it's high touch, high quality, but it's still a manufacturing operation. So one of the things I was shocked when I talked to, and we had labs that ranged from 200 cycles to 2,200 retrievals, and none of them really did what I would call is true manufacturing, forecasting, planning, and execution and adjustment. They'd say, oh yeah, we've got 6 retrievals on Wednesday, 10 transfers, 4 on Thursday, but nowhere was I hearing the number of eggs, and nowhere was I hearing or seeing what that implied for workload to the embryologist over the subsequent 6 days. So I'm looking and thinking, there's no real planning going on here. So what I did literally on an Excel spreadsheet is to say, okay, each patient, here's the follicles forecasted. Here then is given the decay curve, here's the likely M2s, the day ones, day threes, day fives. So for each patient, depending on whether it was an IVF ICSI or egg freezing or a transfer, you could work out the workload from day 0 to day 6 or 7, and then aggregate it up. And you could look a week or 2 weeks ahead and say, oh, wow, yeah, we've got this huge peak on Wednesday and it drops to nothing on Friday or whatever. And to me, that is waste. In the parlance of lean, where I did all I think, that's a waste, because on the down days, there's not enough work to keep you busy. On the peak days, typically a Wednesday or et cetera, they're going crazy. There's overtime, quality issues can happen. So what I did is I said, in the docs that I all talked to, I said, okay, if we have a way to identify and be able to shift the procedure day by plus or minus a day, you could definitely do it programmed FETs, but certainly with good or better responders, you have a wider trigger window. And if you could just shift maybe a 25 or 33% of those good or better responders, you can flatten that workload. And you can adjust for holidays, weekends, whatever. And I've done this on labs, again, 200 to 2,200. I was using, to really do a good job on forecasting the follicle count, et cetera, I actually work with Dr. Schnorr at Cycloclarity, and he has that ability to indicate the trigger window, et cetera. And he's got a version of this, but it's not quite there yet. But I see that, I think, that's a great way of level loading the lab to allow for reduced stress, but also to increase the effective capacity. Because if you knew you could avoid those peaks midweek or whenever, then you could say, okay, we can aim for 15, 20% more retrievals on an average basis and not get swamped. So just a thought, is that, I mean, of course, it requires participation and a more planning with the REIs and the IVF coordinators and you to kind of say on a rolling basis, which of our patients do we feel comfortable that we could shift today? Certainly on the FET side, you can do that. The thaw side, you can do that. But just having that visualization of what the workload is. And what I did was with all the lab directors, I said, okay, what's your average fixed time to set up for an ICSI, for an egg freeze, for a vitrification? What's your average across the embryologist per egg, per embryo, et cetera? So for each step, from retrieval through, the fertilization, checks, biopsies, et cetera, you're creating this model. So anyway, I'll shut up and get your thoughts on that.
No, I think that's really cool. Efficiency in the lab is always a concern. You don't want burned out embryologists. You want embryologists at the top of their game, well rested and ready for the day. And that can be hard to achieve if you have a day where you're working 10 retrievals, 10 transfers. You've got, to maybe 10 hours of work instead of your 8 with a nice lunch break. And I think what you mentioned was key in that it requires collaboration with the entire clinic. And I think when you can have that collaboration, things end up being really positive. Again, I've worked in places that do have really great collaborations. I've worked with some fantastic IVF coordinators, and it's really collaborative. And I've worked places where the lab is so far removed from the clinical side, and that relationship it doesn't work as well.
I've heard some
things.
Lab directors call their IVF coordinators IVF disc coordinators.
I haven't heard that. I've been lucky to work with some really great coordinators.
I think what this gets to at the heart of is this idea, obviously, between a great team and a team that maybe is everybody's functioning in their own silo. And Elise, I would love to know from your end, because I have my opinions. I have my opinions about way too many things, but I would love to know your opinions about what you think makes a great embryology team integrated within the greater clinic.
One thing that I have had a focus on recently is team leads and lab managers, because I find that there's oftentimes that lab managers are the best embryologists, but that doesn't mean they necessarily can lead a team of people. They may not have the people management skills. And I've been talking to a lot of lab directors. I also have no interest in being a lab director. That sounds like the most stressful job. So I commend all the lab directors out there. They do great work. But there's so much push for training on skills, right? How to do the best ICSI, how to do the best biopsy. Are we investing that same amount of time and money and effort into developing good leaders who can manage people and bridge the gap between the lab and the clinic? And I think that person is so key. How do we create an open dialogue to address concerns on both sides, to approach conversations professionally and effectively when you're giving constructive feedback to someone? And those soft skills, I don't think are invested in as much as they should be. And I think that is a real key on being able to bridge the gap between clinic and lab.
There was a good webinar this week by I3 on just that. Jason Swain's twin brother.
I've had like 4 people talk to me about that. I haven't had a chance to go back and watch it, but it's really good. It's Dean Morbeck and Jordan's Colonel Jordan Swain. Really, I mean, they look identical. It's hilarious. They're twins.
But they are twins.
They are twins. Yeah.
They are twins. Yeah. I put one question there in the chat before, and I'd love to get your thoughts before Dr. Amols kicks me off. I've been advising a firm based largely in Australia, because that's where the research was done. And they're taking another look at NAD+. Now, it's been done before, in this case, infusing culture media with the NAD+. And what their research and the most recent research showed, both in Australia, and they've got a team in China too, that with mouse embryos, with older mouse embryos, having the media infused with the NAD plus effectively resulted in good equivalent blast rates for younger mouse embryos. And with looking at it under the microscope, they saw just improved meiotic division, and having the NAD plus there. And so they're now in the process of doing donated human oocyte trials. And if you can get that kind of level of good blast rates in older oocytes, that could be huge. I would imagine. What's your thoughts? I mean, and there has been NAD plus research for a while, but this seems to be more positive. What they claim is that they've really improved the formulation process and the right amount of NAD plus in it to have that kind of impact.
I have had conversations with other embryologists recently, and I think there is a lot of room for us to continue to improve our culture media. Back in the day, we weren't able to culture past day 3 because our media didn't allow it. And so now we've jumped that hurdle of culturing past day 3. I still think there are a lot of improvements that can be made to media to support development more. And so that is kind of along those lines of what can we change, what can we add to improve development on the culture side. So that sounds very interesting. It's definitely not my area of expertise, but it sounds like some interesting research. We went from manufacturing your culture media, and every single lab had their own culture media, to now you buy it commercially. And so we're getting a lot more data because it's more standardized, and it'll be interesting to see how we can improve that culture media, because it does make a difference. We know the culture system is so important. There's a reason why we do pH all the time and all these other things, and new incubators and all this stuff. So the media is due for an upgrade, I think.
Thanks again, Steve. Appreciate it.
I always enjoy it. You know it.
You always go to good questions. It's interesting. He was talking about the NAD as, it's kind of like the same thought with the CoQ10, that's these supplements, these things that are going to, help, fix women who have, are going to have less blasts. I think the question I don't think any of us have the answer to is, just because you make more blasts doesn't mean that they're going to be good, and that's the question, is how many blasts are not making it. We actually did a study at our clinic. We didn't never publish or anything, but just curious, thought, how many of these embryos that are not making the blast, what would the DNA in them? We wanted to know. So we went and we sent all of the rested embryos, and we sent them to be tested, and like almost all of them came back abnormal. Almost all of them came back with aneuploidy. So there's no question there was like 1 or 2 that would come back with euploid status, but again, that was probably some divisional issue that when it was developing, has nothing to do with the DNA in them. But I know what he's talking about. Like I said, I still have a hard time believing that, and again, I'm hoping I'm wrong, that somehow we're just going to be able to get the DNA to repair itself completely, with full chromosomal. You're talking about an entire chromosome, missing or added. There's the point here where I always say it's a numbers game. My hope is someday we can take a biopsy, have 1,000 eggs, and that's how we're going to be able to grow everything in the lab, and this becomes so much easier. So
that would be very interesting. You see the studies on ovarian tissue. They're freezing ovarian tissue and then using it for stimulation in the future. And I always find that I found that to be really interesting for very young prepubescent children who have cancer, and that's their only option, sort of thing. And lots of really interesting techniques and technology on the horizon. All this whole conversation has just got me excited. I'm like, there's so much science that's on its way, and we're so close.
We are. So when Steve was talking about, this idea of spreading out the workload, as an embryologist, if you can talk to the people here, like, what is the hardest thing you feel as an embryologist doing? Like, is there anything where you're like, man, this is tough? Like, is it the biopsy? Is it ICSI? What part do you feel like, is there anything that's harder than another?
I personally think that ICSI is harder than biopsy. there's a lot more to manage. So you're managing sperm in your needle, you're moving from drop to drop a lot more. You have to manage multiple eggs in a drop, that sort of thing. But ICSI is also my favorite procedure to do because of that. I feel like it adds, you feel really accomplished when you have an ICSI go really well. You put all the eggs away and you're like, that was the one, that went so well. So while I think it's the most difficult, in my opinion, I also think it's the most fun to do because of that reason. My least favorite thing to do in the lab, so not necessarily the most challenging, but what I don't necessarily enjoy is not the lab work, it's the other stuff. It's I don't even mind the paperwork. It's the tank stuff for me. I never loved doing like tank inventory. So inventorying all of the samples in a tank, or validating new tanks. There's so much more out there now to make it easier, like all of the automated systems and barcoding and things like that. But I have spent days and days and days and hours like inventorying tanks and filling tanks and validating tanks. And I know cryo management is a big undertaking for most labs and most clinics.
One of the patients had a question here, and it's kind of one of the questions I wanted to ask you. I thought it would be great for people to hear when it comes to grading. I think that's one mystery is how they come at grading, right? I mean, my wife, she graded me. She's like, he's a 10, but realistically, we all know it's not true, right? So it's in the eyes of the beholder. And so, like this patient talks about here that she her last all her embryos are 4BB, and they're all lower than the last 4 that they transferred before. And so her thought is like, she's worried about this. And it's interesting. I'm actually doing like about a couple of weeks ago a podcast about this idea of like grading and what it really means and what it doesn't mean. But for me, I'd love to know, like, how do you grade it? I mean, do you ever feel bad? Do you ever like for example, you got a patient, you're like, oh, they have no embryos. This one really doesn't meet the grade. We're gonna tell Dr. Amols he looks better than he does. Like, how do you approach that? I feel like it would be very difficult and to be consistent all the time, and because you're making the decision of whether someone's embryo gets transferred or doesn't get transferred.
That is a really good point and a nuance that I don't think people think about all the time. It is very case specific. It can be case specific. As much as we want to be unbiased, stuff like that does make a difference. If you're looking at a patient case where all the embryos are beautiful, and then you look at a case where the embryos are just so, you've just come off of this case where all the embryos are beautiful. That has to have an impact on the embryos you're looking at next. Or even embryos within the same, cohort of embryos. The first one you look, I keep saying this, but I have these conversations all the time and I love talking about this stuff. You're looking at an embryo, you're like, this is the best embryo I've ever seen all day. I'm going to give this one an AA. Then you go to the next drop and you're like, this one is nicer than the one I just saw. So now I'm going to go back because I want this one to be selected before the one I just saw because this one is better. I'm going to now give this one a slightly lower grade. But if I hadn't seen that embryo, the next embryo, that one would have had the highest grade. And so things like that are so, patients don't always know that that's kind of the mindset sometimes. It's like, it's relative to patients that you've just seen. It's relative to the embryos in the dish. It's relative to the clinic that you're at. Potentially the time you have to do the embryo grading. All of those things come into play when you're grading embryos. Patient case, if it's their only one, that's when I'm usually calling an embryologist over and saying, look, this is the one the patient has. Give me your thoughts too. Let's talk about this. Let's collaborate and see what we want to do. I think it's an important thing to consider for patients. In general, I like to say if it's something an embryologist froze, they think it's worth transferring. I don't want to spend my time freezing something I don't think is worth transferring. I don't want a patient to go through a cycle that I don't think is worth the time or money. So I try to go into that with that mindset when I'm grading embryos for patients.
Interesting. Yeah, the concept I was trying to, and I'm trying to put in this podcast, I haven't put it together yet. So you're hearing me think my thought process right here, was this idea of even like doctors, like for example, even the worst student in medical school is still called doctor, right? And there's no question, some of the best doctors are going to become neurologists. Other than that, fertility doctors, of course. And then the worst doctors, I'm saying like they might go into something a little bit easier, right? Let's say like family medicine, but they can all still practice medicine. Now, the people who can't get into medicine, right? They don't become doctors. And so when I look at grading, it's kind of like the thought, like we use the Marius grading system, which is a little bit wider than just the Gardner grading system. But I try to explain to people that the grading isn't like everything that gets to the transferable point. The A and the B's, there's slight difference in implantation. But I understand the concept. If it didn't work with the best, then they go, well, why will it work with the other ones? And in reality, that's not true. They're all doctors. That's kind of, again, it's still working out in my head how.
No, I like that. I like that. It's a
what
good.
I'm trying to say is that they can all still implant, and all the grading is saying which one's going to have the best chance of implanting. But that doesn't mean the other ones can't. And that's really something a lot of patients have a hard time with. I mean, I've had people go through another IVF retrieval just because their embryos weren't all good grade, and I try to tell people we don't freeze stuff that's not going to implant because most of them won't even survive the thaw a lot of times. So,
yeah, that's that's surprising that I know patients, they put a lot of weight on the grades, but going through another retrieval, I hadn't thought about patients considering doing that. Yeah, I always encourage patients, if they're concerned about their grades or want a little bit more information about how the grading at their clinic works, to reach out. Some of them have handouts, some may have a video to explain a little bit more about the grading. But yeah, I agree that I like the physician, the med school metaphor. I think that's a good one.
Like I said, I'll come up with something when the podcast gets out. I'm still coming up with an analogy, but I have a ton of questions. I'm going to let Dr. Salem ask because I have so many more questions for you. So,
no, I wanted to see if maybe we can get to some of our the questions that have been sent in here. So maybe we'll do them quickly. We'll do like a little rapid fire questions.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely.
One came in here. It's a really interesting question. Any more research surrounding mitochondrial therapy for eggs or embryos?
Oh my gosh, this is a hard one for rapid fire.
It is a hard one. How about just your 30-second blurb on it?
Yeah. The research at this point there's not a lot of research on it. There is a group out in Oregon, I believe, that's done some interesting work, not necessarily on mitochondria, but stem cells into blasts and eggs and sperm and things like that. And that's really cool research. I think it's getting approval for research like that. That's hard, at least here. So research is limited. I think that's it. I'm trying to keep it short.
I like it. All right, here's the next question. Interest in the relationship between egg quality and estrogen level from an embryologist standpoint.
Not my area of expertise.
Fair.
I'm going to be honest.
I like it.
That's a good point. That's a good point, because I think one of the things is one of the next questions that comes up is it says, sometimes we need a doctor embryologist for consultation after failure. Is that something possible? And I think that's something really impressive, at least that you said. It's not your area of expertise. And that's where I think some of the doctors, where we come in, right? It's our job to take the complex embryology that you tell us, and then we have to put it in a way for patients to understand, because you are an amazing social embryologist. That is not true for everyone. There are some embryologists that are amazing embryologists, but you are not going to want to go out to dinner with. They're just not very social. And so that's where the doctor interaction comes in. So anyways, this question now comes to this part. Do you talk to the patients directly, or do you find that, it's better sometimes to talk to the doctor than the doctor talk to them?
Definitely, like your point about some embryologists are not as social. A lot of people get into embryology because they're like, I don't want to talk to anyone. That's why I got on socials, because I was like, I don't want to talk to all these people. I think I like the collaborative approach in general. I just think I value team collaboration so much, because we don't know it all, and we are also not physicians, so we can't give medical advice. We don't always know the full patient history or the conversations you've had with a patient prior to them going through a cycle. So I'm always of the mindset of I want to write as many notes as I can to provide for the physician. And if they want to bring me in on something to explain something specifically or get a little bit more information about a note or a remark I made in a patient chart, I'm all for that. In general, I typically shy away from like direct patient interaction just because I'm not a physician and don't want to misspeak and don't know a patient's full medical history.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that's exactly when that question came out. I thought it's a great answer. I mean, it's just like me. I'm not an embryologist, but I'm able to understand enough that when the embryologist talks to me, I'm able to explain it to the patient. I'll let Dr. Slam keep going with the shooting up the questions here.
Yeah, this is a nice one too. This question is, can embryologists always notice when there is cell damage to an embryo? I think so. I'm gonna ask another question that I think this question is getting at, which is, can you always tell if an embryo is sort of non-viable after thaw? I think that's what this question is getting at.
Yeah, we can see cell damage to an extent. So when the cells are damaged, they kind of, it's hard to explain without a picture, but they create these little wisps on the outside. So the cells will start to take in a lot of fluid and get big, and then they eventually burst and die. And so we can see some of that right after thaw, but there are lots of times where we'll see an embryo, will thaw it looks really good. It may even start to re-expand, but then it kind of stops at that point. It doesn't continue to re-expand. And I've seen this in cases where we may be doing a thaw biopsy refreeze. So embryos were frozen previously, not biopsied. They now want to thaw them and biopsy them. And, sometimes, typically after a couple hours, they should re-expand, maybe hatch. But maybe there's one that at the thaw looked really good, but it's not fully re-expanding now. What are we going to do? Are we going to continue to do the biopsy? That's usually when I'm like, lab manager, this is what's happening. Let's have a conversation about what we're going to do. So it's yes and no. Sometimes we can see it right away and we know this isn't looking good. And other times it's like a slow to re-expand, and it's not necessarily dead, but it's not doing what it should.
Right. And it's this fine balance between never wanting to quote unquote waste an embryo that might have an opportunity to lead to a baby versus kind of being almost definitive about saying, hey, this embryo is not going to work. We need to move on to the next one and give the patient a better chance at a transfer. It's a hard line to toe, but I feel like, as embryologists and as doctors, we are on the right side of being conservative. We would never want to waste an embryo here. And I think that's really the ultimate thing. Again, it goes back to this ethos of do no harm. All right, I'm going to shoot another one at you here. Do 3-day embryos have a high or low chance for implantation and development? And then this patient's asking, this viewer is asking, do you recommend patients to freeze embryos on day 5 rather than day 3?
Ooh, so I'd love to hear some of y'all's thoughts on this, because I think sometimes the physician or physicians or the clinic's philosophy on this can impact what we do in the lab. In general, most clinics have moved away from day 3 freezing to day 5 culture, because like I've said before, that day 3 hump is a big one. So we see a lot of attrition after day 3, which is why when we can only culture to day 3, we transfer 2 or 3 embryos at a time, because a lot of those wouldn't have made it to day 5. So it gives us a lot more information when we're culturing from day 3 to day 5. I have seen cases where we'll do a day 3 transfer if a patient has a couple of embryos, say they've only got 2 or 3. We'll do a day 3 transfer. They're not doing PGT. They're a good candidate for a fresh transfer. Let's go ahead and put them back. That's kind of been my experience. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts, because that's one I get a lot.
I can tell you, we know day 3 embryos themselves don't implant at that time, right? So no matter what, they have to still have to culture in now the uterus, and then eventually implant. And I think when you look at from a science standpoint, right, embryos are falling in to the uterus around day 4, day 5. So it's not natural for day 3 embryos to go in there anyway. So I do believe there are some risk by doing that. As you mentioned, in the past, we did it because we had to. I mean, I remember the days when there was no freezing day 3, day 5 embryos before vitrification. It just didn't happen. And so you're right. You had to be higher risk, put more embryos back. You had to freeze things at the pronuclear stage. And so it was different then. But the thing is that, as I told you, that little kind of study we did to show ourselves, all the embryos were pretty much aneuploid when they stalled. And so I truly, we have moved to a complete day 5, clinic. And honestly, like, if you look at pregnancy rates, and I truly believe this, if it's not going to make it to day 5, it probably wasn't getting a pregnant anyways. And my joke I always tell people is like, everything always looks good on day 3 because it's just so early. And I tell them it's like when people go for a job. On orientation day, everyone looks amazing because no one's done anything, right? Even 3 days later, you're like, John and Sally are great, but it's on, 2 weeks later, you're like, John sucks at his job. Like, we got to get rid of him. And that's day 5. It's really allowed a lot of DNA to get there. And so this idea of what's better, the question that they're asking is it possible that some embryos are not making day 5 because the environment is bad? And I think that's absolutely true back in the past. But as you mentioned, the culture environments are getting better and better. We're not making our own media. We can't have the wrong amount of percentage now. There's lot numbers we can track and stuff. And so I just don't know if that's there yet. I don't think it's as much of a problem, which leads me to then my next question. Automation. So you mentioned about AI making it better. One of the things is that AI, and automation may go together. And eventually, I mean, do you think by not having different people at different learning levels at different techniques, will that be the big difference? And how do you think that's going to affect embryology? Because I mean, you still need embryologists. It's just now like maybe the ICSI will be automated, or maybe I think the thawing and freezing would be one of the biggest benefits of automation, is where I think, because the drop size and everything would be exactly what you need it to be.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think that's one of the biggest things that has not been standardized is training. Embryologists are trained very different. Techniques are not standardized because we're human. We're not perfect people. So I love that point, because it's not something that we have standardized at this point. I do think automation is coming to the extent where vitrification is a good one, drop size, timing in terms of all of the medias, all of those things coming. There are some embryologists that are nervous about automation, and I'm like, I don't think it's ever going to take our jobs. I'm not concerned. Ultimately, for me, you have to get back to, why are we doing this? We're doing this to improve pregnancy rates, to help patients. And if automation does that, that's what I'm here for. Yeah. So I'm on board for things like that. And I do think some standardization to training, or to skill level to some extent is going to make a difference in the long run for sure.
Yeah. There was a question someone asked over on Instagram, and it was, can we talk about the difference between day 5 and day 6? And I think what they're just saying is like, I know from embryology, I'm going to try to put it into an embryology question, because obviously there's difference between day 5 and day 6 embryos. But I always make the point that sometimes a day 6 embryo is a day 6 embryo because you're doing the biopsy, right? And so you can freeze at stage 2 or 3 if you want an embryo, although not a lot of places do. But you can't biopsy that level; you'll hurt the embryo more. And so I'd love to know for you, like, how do you decide when to make a decision of, like, if I'm gonna freeze on day 5, freeze on day 6? If you're doing the biopsy, what plays factor into all that? And then I think her question then specifically is, do you think there's a difference in pregnancy rates, which the data shows there is, but it depends on why it's being done. Like, again, it took longer to grow to the blastocyst, or was it because you were going to be ready to do something on it?
That is exactly what I was going to say, is there's so many little things behind the scenes that patients don't have the knowledge on and aren't explained. So Great point. A lot of times when we were doing PGT, it's an embryo that we would freeze on day 5, but we don't feel like it's ready to biopsy. And so we'll push it to day 6. The other thing that comes into play is what time you're checking the embryos. So if you have a time lapse incubator, you can check them whenever you want. You can check them in the morning and then say, hey, it's not ready. Let's check it again in the afternoon. Whereas some clinics will say, we do one check at this time of day, and if it's not ready, we don't recheck it until the next day. And so who's to say 6 hours later, hey, you're doing the check at 10 o'clock, 6 hours later, it's not ready for biopsy. Because we don't want to, open and close the incubators too much. And so that comes into play a lot. And then you can get even more detailed into what time did you do the ICSI? How many hours post ICSI is it really? So day 5 in the morning for one patient that when ICSI was done really late in the afternoon is really bordering day 4, early day 5 sort of thing. So all of those little nuances come into play, which is why I think we see so much variation in the research, because are we taking those things into consideration? Are we being specific about the hours post ICSI, or are we going just based on it's 8 o'clock in the morning on day 5 versus how many hours post insemination? I am one to not risk a biopsy if I don't feel like the embryo is ready. We want to have enough cells. We want the cells to not be too plump. That's what I always say is when they're really plump, they're more likely to lyse in that biopsy needle. And I don't want to risk having to take a second biopsy. Let's push it. I want this to be as safe as it can be, which means sometimes there are day 6 embryos. The other thing that I've seen more often is these thaw biopsy refreezes. So now a lot of times clinics and embryologists are going into this saying, this is a freeze only case, but what if we have to biopsy this 2 years down the line?
Yeah.
Does that play a factor in when we decide to freeze, even if it's just a freeze only case?
Yeah, makes sense. So the other questions I have for you, these are, and again, I'm sorry I'm throwing all these at you and stealing the show here from Dr. Salem. But they're ones I think that are really good for patients to understand. And I think these are really the questions that people get scared about. One of them is biopsy. And it doesn't matter how many times I tell them, I'm like, listen, biopsy is not going to hurt your embryo, but there's not complete truth in that, meaning, yes, if I do it, I will kill their embryo. It is no question. I have no clue what I'm doing. That embryo will be dead by the time I'm done. But in experienced hands, a lot of people are very afraid about it. To them, removing cells off, they're not understanding how few cells you're taking or the technique you're using. I always tell people I think ICSI is actually more dangerous than biopsies, as long as someone's good at doing the biopsy. But I'd love to have your view and what you could tell viewers about why they should feel safe when you're doing a biopsy, like the techniques and stuff that you use.
So we talked briefly about the amount of training that it takes to do some of these skills. So biopsy is typically one of the last skills an embryologist learns. So they've already mastered ICSI, which in my opinion is a more difficult procedure than biopsy. All of the monitoring is done on statistics. So if embryos are surviving biopsy, thaws, what your no-read rates are for PGT testing, all of those things. Now, can we say for sure it doesn't cause stress to the embryos? No, but so does all of the other things that we do. Opening the incubator, handling the embryos at all. So there's some interesting research being done on stress biomarkers. So are we seeing higher rates of these, stress markers or DNA expression of embryos that have undergone this treatment or that treatment or exposed to these things? And so we're learning a lot more about how embryos react to different exposures, whether that's handling, whether that's a specific air quality, all of those things. Really interesting research. I think we're going to learn a lot. And hopefully that changes how we handle embryos and may give us more information about biopsy. Could this be causing an issue? But so far, the research that we do have is showing minimal risk to embryo development, pregnancy rates. So we'll see what more research brings.
Here's another question that again, I really want people to hear from an embryologist. And that is, I didn't know about this until this patient told me. But they when someone wants to move embryos to another clinic. Now, I don't know where you're at if that happens a lot, but we're in a place where there's a lot of clinics and sometimes people move embryos. And this patient told me she was terrified that she didn't want to say anything bad or make anyone mad at clinic because she was worried they would hurt her embryos. And I said to her, I go, please understand that the lab themselves, like I said, would never do something like that. And like, if I even went in there and told them, hurt those embryos, they'd say, no, that's unethical and stuff. But I think it's, important for patients to know that you guys are completely independent. Sure, you're viewed by the doctor, and the medical director is checking your statistics with the lab director and stuff. But, I think it's good for patients to know that there's nothing wrong moving your embryos. When you guys talk to another facility, it's just like a business transaction. There's no, angst or anything like that, and that you wouldn't ever harm them. And that's the thing I try to get to them. I just think it's great for the embryologist to be able to say, like, yeah, like you understand the importance of these, and there's, that's not your job
Yeah, I can't speak for every embryologist, but 99.999% of embryologists are getting into this because they want to help patients. It's a rewarding job. It's an interesting job. They like the science. And we know how valuable and how cherished these embryos are to patients. And so it makes me really sad that a patient would think that. I can definitely understand how they got there, because you think, oh, I'm not their patient anymore, so they're going to be upset with me and could do, like at a restaurant, I sent my food back, so now they're going to spit in it, sort of thing. And that is definitely not the case. We know how valuable embryos are for patients, and just because someone is moving them doesn't mean they were unhappy with the care they got here. Maybe they've moved somewhere. Maybe their physician has moved and they're wanting to continue treatment with that physician. We also, in general, know all the embryologists around, and we're all really good friends. So in my area, there are 6 practices 30 minutes from each other. Like, they're all within, like, they're so literally, one of them's half a mile. You could like throw a stone and there's one right there. We all know each other and we're all really good friends. It's not like a competition sort of deal. There's lots of support. A lot of them have group chats, so it's like, hey, we're struggling with this specific thing in the lab, what do you guys do? So it's very collaborative. I'm a big collaborative person, and so all the embryologists in the area typically know each other and would not jeopardize a patient success for something. Of
course
like
that. And it was sad for me to hear that. And but I even try to tell them, I'm like, understand, even if I asked my embryologist to do that, they wouldn't do that. I'm like that's how, like I said, you understand that they're independent from that, and I was just waiting for you to come back on, Dr. Salem. I was like, okay, I gotta keep the show going until you get here. There was before I know we're getting near the end here and stuff, and Dr. Salem, I know if you have a question. I have one more, but I was gonna let you ask. I think you're muted right now.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, so many questions. I think a lot of great ones have been answered. So I'll let you take this one away.
Yeah, I just thought for people who are interested in becoming an embryologist, what would you tell them to do? I mean, I think it's not a common job people think about. It is it's looking under a microscope a lot, and so. But I'd love to hear what you would tell people who are interested in it and what to do. I mean, there's schools out there, but there's other ways to get into it too.
Yeah, I always say it takes more time to prep for the procedure than it does to actually do the ICSI or do the other things. we do look at the microscope a good bit of time. So I think the first thing is if you're interested in embryology, see if you can learn more about what the day-to-day looks like, because I think, even from what I show on social media, that's not what our day looks like all the time, right? So we're not always in the microscope or having these cool things or having the best day. That's definitely not the case. There are pressures. There are things to consider about the field in general. And so do a little bit more digging. If you have a chance to maybe shadow at a lab or shadow at a training center, there's some training centers out there. Do that so you can get an idea of what it looks like from the day to day. I had a conversation with a student today, actually, who was interested in embryology. She was like, can I call you? And I was like, please do. I'll give you all the pros and all the cons. So I think having that conversation is great. anyone is listening is always welcome to reach out to me if they're wanting. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to be straightforward. There are a lot of fantastic things about the field, things that I love, things that keep me going every day, and the reason why I don't see myself leaving this field anytime soon. But there are things that are cons as well. Like we've talked about before, the pressure is there. We know how important this is. There is very little room for error, zero room for error here. This high stakes. It can potentially be spending a long time sitting at a microscope, using your hands, and that can cause some fatigue on your body, a lot of mental focus. So you have mental fatigue. So there's lots of pros and cons, but if someone is interested, definitely see if you can shadow. I think a strong foundation in a science is definitely needed. So genetics, animal science is a really common major for embryologists because they get a lot of repro classes. Chemistry, biology are all really common. You can consider a master's program. They do a really great job of doing the hard science kind of on the background. And then it's getting into the lab and seeing if those skills are something that you have. You have to have some fine motor skills there to be working on such a small scale. And I think it's also important to know that it takes some time to develop. So typically years. I still feel like I'm learning. There's still things I can improve on. There's so much science out there. And so knowing that it's someone who wants to continuously learn, embryology is a great field for that because there's always going to be new techniques, new science that comes out. Important to take all of those things into consideration when you're choosing a field.
And I know there's some schools out there too now that they have, that they're expensive, but you can go in and you can, for a month or two, learn a lot of skills, and it doesn't make you an embryologist. It just gives you kind of a foundation to maybe allow a place that wants to pick up an embryologist, say, hey, we want to start from the beginning. And so they can bring someone in who has a little bit more skills. And so I know that's something that some will do, but you can also just, see if a fertility clinic is interested in starting with an andrologist. And that's usually why I tell people, as I said, get an andrologist position at a place, entry-level position, and then you can usually work your way up too. And that's what we do at our place as well.
That's what I did.
Yeah.
So.
And then I wanted to show you this. I thought it was really funny. So the other day I went to go watch a movie with my kids, and it's just so funny when you're in fertility and stuff, how everything you see in the world is different. And this is supposed to be a bowling ball, I guess, at this place we're going to watch the movie at. And I looked at it and I said to myself, a 3 p.m. Oh my goodness.
I was thinking the same thing.
So it's just, I thought you'd find that funny too, that, this bowling ball and your fertility, that's a 3 p.m. There's something wrong with that embryo.
You see them out in nature. When you start getting into the lab, all you can see is eggs and sperm. It really starts to become a little bit of an obsession. You should see my office. It's filled with eggs and sperm all over everything.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm going to let Dr. Salem end the show here just because, like I said, I've been talking the whole time.
No, it's been wonderful. I mean, this has been just like an awesome conversation, getting to hear your insights, about what you do in the lab, and having, the viewers, the patients kind of get a sense of what happens a little bit behind the scenes there. And I think it's just incredible. I think this is such a team, sport, IVF and our world. And, there are many very integral players, and you're at the center of that. And so I think it's so good that we had some of these questions answered and many more. I really encourage everybody to check out your TikTok and your Instagram. They're just phenomenal. And we look forward to hopefully having another one of these chats sometime in the future.
Yeah, and I hope people see, you guys you're not just some lab person in there, that you guys care, that your heart's in it. When they fail, you guys feel like you failed. And you're right. There's a lot of pressure on embryologists, and we try to with ours. We let them know they're human. We know that. And, that sometimes it's just things don't go that way. And so anyways, thank you again. And anything else you have for our audience that you want to give them?
No, I was just going to say thanks for having me. This has probably been one of my favorite chats I've had, definitely this year. I know it's only February, but in a long time. It's y'all have been so fun. The conversation has been so great. And if this is any indication of how you chat with your embryologist, you have a fantastic team, I must say, because having this dialogue, I can tell, having this dialogue with physicians isn't always isn't always there. And so anyone listening, they got a team. I can already tell they have a fantastic team. So if y'all are ever looking for an embryologist right now.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you guys so much. Yeah, have a
Thanks
great
for having me.
evening, everybody.
Have a great evening.